The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a constant lullaby in her life, a sound that meant everything was working, that for one more moment a life was holding on. For Clara, it was the soundtrack to her world. She moved through the busy cardiac ward with a quiet grace that belied the exhaustion etched deep into her soul. Her worn-out sneakers squeaked softly on the polished linoleum floor as she weaved between beds, checking 4 drips, adjusting pillows, and offering a gentle, reassuring smile to anyone who needed it. Her scrubs, a faded shade of blue, had been washed so many times they felt like a second skin, soft and thin in places. A deep tiredness had settled in her bones, a kind that no amount of sleep could seem to fix. It was a tiredness that started in her heart and spread all the way to her fingertips. Her life was a carefully constructed house of cards, built on double shifts and skipped meals. Every penny she earned was already spent, earmarked for bills or, more importantly, for her brother, Leo. Just thinking his name brought a familiar ache to her chest, a mix of fierce love and gut-wrenching worry. He was younger than her by only 2 years, but his life was a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of the hospital ward. His world was a small, quiet room, filled with the soft hum of an oxygen machine and the shelves of books he could no longer hold. A rare genetic disorder had stolen his strength, his mobility, and his future, leaving him dependent on her for everything. During a rare, quiet moment, Clara ducked into the small break room, the smell of stale coffee and microwave soup filling the air. She leaned against the counter and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a picture of Leo, his face pale but his eyes bright, a wide smile stretched across his face. It was from a better day, a day they had managed to get outside in his wheelchair to the park. She remembered the feeling of the sun on her skin and the sound of his laughter, a sound so precious it felt like a treasure. A notification popped up, a reminder from her banking app. A new bill had arrived. The amount was enough to make her feel sick. It was for a new medication, one the doctor said could make a real difference, but the cost was astronomical. She quickly silenced the notification, shoving the phone back into her pocket as if the number itself could burn her. This was the constant, gnawing fear that lived with her. The fear that one day the house of cards would come tumbling down and she wouldn't be able to build it back up. The ward was buzzing with a different kind of energy that afternoon, a nervous excitement that rippled through the nurses and doctors. It wasn't the usual chaos of a medical emergency. It was something else. A whisper passed between 2 of her colleagues at the nurses' station. "He's here," one said, her eyes wide. "The big boss from Sterling Corp." Clara didn't pay much attention at first. Important people came through the hospital all the time, but the whispers kept coming. He wasn't just any CEO. He was Damian Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with cold, hard success. They said he was ruthless in business, a shark who smelled blood in the water from a mile away. And now he was a patient in their care. The whole floor seemed to hold its breath. The hospital administrator, a man who usually barely acknowledged the nursing staff, was personally overseeing the preparations for his arrival, making sure the private room was perfect and that the staff on duty was, in his words, the very best. Clara was assigned to his care. Of course she was. She was one of the most dedicated nurses on the floor, but as she walked towards the newly designated VIP room, a sense of dread washed over her. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and pushed the door open. The room was larger than the others, with a window that overlooked the city skyline. And in the center of the room, propped up against a mountain of pristine white pillows, was him. Damian Sterling. He didn't look like a man recovering from a heart condition. He looked like a king holding court in his castle. Even in a hospital gown, he had an air of immense power, his presence filling the room and sucking all the air out of it. His hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes, a sharp, piercing gray, were fixed on her the moment she entered. They were the kind of eyes that missed nothing. "You're my nurse?" he asked. His voice was low and smooth, but it held an edge of steel, a tone that was used to giving commands, not asking questions. "Yes, sir. I'm Clara. I'll be looking after you," she replied, her voice professional and calm, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She approached the bed, her movements practiced and efficient, ready to check his vitals. He watched her every move, his gaze unnervingly intense. As she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, he spoke again. "You look tired." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an expression of concern. It was an observation, stated as a simple fact, but it felt like an accusation. It cut right through her professional armor and touched the raw, exhausted part of her she tried so hard to hide. Clara didn't look up from her work. "It's been a long day, sir. It's a busy floor." She kept her voice neutral, focusing on the numbers on the monitor. "I'm sure it is," he said, his eyes still on her. "Running around all day, fixing other people's problems. It must be tiring." The way he said the word tiring made it sound like a weakness, a flaw. She could feel his eyes on her, not just looking at her, but assessing her, like she was a piece of property he was considering buying. She finished her checks quickly and efficiently, jotting down the numbers on her chart, her hand steady. She had faced down angry family members and dealt with life-or-death situations without flinching. But this man, this quiet, observing man, made her feel more exposed than she had in years. She felt like he could see right through her faded scrubs and tired smile, down to the mountain of debt and the desperate secrets she kept locked away. As she turned to leave the room, she felt his gaze on her back, a heavy, suffocating weight. She closed the door softly behind her, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The beep of the heart monitor from the room next door sounded like a comfort now, a return to the world she understood. But the feeling of his sharp, gray eyes stayed with her, a lingering sense of unease that told her this was just the beginning. The days that followed settled into a new, uncomfortable rhythm. Clara's world, which had once been the entire bustling ward, now seemed to shrink to the four walls of Damien Sterling's private room. He was her constant, her primary focus. His health was, thankfully, improving steadily. The color returned to his face and his voice grew stronger, but with that strength came a change in him. He was no longer just a sick man. He was a predator recovering his strength, and Clara felt like the only prey in sight. His eyes followed her everywhere. When she changed the fourth bag, she could feel his gaze on the back of her neck. When she brought his meals, he watched her hands, as if memorizing their every move. He started asking small, personal questions, disguised as casual conversation. "Do you have a long commute, Clara?" he'd ask, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "A person needs their rest, especially in your line of work?" Another time he glanced at her worn-out sneakers and said, "You should invest in better shoes. Your foundation is everything. If your feet hurt, your whole day is ruined." Each comment was a tiny, sharp needle, pricking at the insecurities she tried so hard to keep buried. He was mapping her life. Not with questions, but with observations. And it terrified her. One afternoon she was on a short break in the corridor, leaning against the wall and scrolling through her phone, looking at the latest, impossibly high bill for Leo's medication. She was so lost in the numbers that she didn't hear the soft sound of his wheelchair approaching. "Problems with the accounts?" His voice cut through her concentration. Clara jumped, quickly shoving the phone into her pocket. "Just a personal matter, sir. Nothing to worry about." But she knew he had seen. She saw the flicker of understanding in his gray eyes, a look that said he had identified her pressure point. He began to test her in small ways. He would ask her to fetch a specific, obscure financial newspaper from the gift shop on the ground floor, one they never stocked. When she returned empty-handed, he wouldn't get angry. He'd just smile, a thin, knowing smile, and say, "A shame. A person should be resourceful." He'd ask her to find a specific pen he claimed to have lost, a pen that was clearly expensive and personal. He was gauging her willingness to go beyond her duties, to bend the rules for him. Clara handled each request with professional politeness, but a cold knot of dread was tightening in her stomach. She knew this was a game and she was an unwilling player. She felt like a mouse being circled by a cat, the cat not yet hungry, but just enjoying the power. The slow, terrifying dance before the final pounce. The final pounce came on a Tuesday evening. The ward was quiet, the hustle of the day having faded into a gentle hum. Most of the visitors had gone home and the lights were dimmed. Clara was doing her final rounds before the night shift took over. As she entered Sterling's room, he was sitting up in bed, looking unusually alert. He pressed the call button. When she arrived, he didn't ask for his pain medication or a glass of water. He looked at the other nurse who was on duty with her and said, "Could you give us a moment, please? I need to discuss something private with Clara." The other nurse shot Clara a curious look before shrugging and leaving the room. Pulling the door almost closed behind her. "Sit," Sterling said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. It wasn't a request. Clara sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart starting to beat a little faster. He looked at her for a long moment, the silence in the room growing heavy and thick. "I've been watching you, Clara," he began, his voice low and smooth. "You're a good nurse. You're compassionate. You carry yourself with a quiet dignity. But you're also tired. You're carrying a weight that no one should have to carry alone." Clara didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, her mouth dry. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Your brother, Leo, a rare genetic disorder. The medical bills must be astronomical. I imagine it feels like you're trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup." The blood drained from Clara's face. He knew everything. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. He had had her investigated. The room felt suddenly cold, and the air seemed to thin. "I can make it all go away," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Every single bill. The best specialists in the country. A private room for him with round-the-clock care. A fund set up for the rest of his life, so he never wants for anything. And you could quit one of your jobs. You could sleep. You could have a life." The words hung in the air, beautiful and impossible. It was every prayer she had ever whispered in the dead of night, every desperate wish made on a falling star. For a fleeting, dizzying second, she felt a wave of pure, unadulterated hope so powerful it almost brought her to tears. She saw Leo's face, not pale and tired in his bed, but smiling, healthy. She saw herself not exhausted and worried, but peaceful. It was a dream, a heaven he was offering with a few simple words. Then he leaned back against his pillows, the dreamlike expression on his face hardening into something else, something cold and calculating. He reached for a folder on his bedside table and slid it across to her. "But as I said, in my world, nothing is free. Everything is a transaction." Clara's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of a man she recognized from the business news, a rival CEO, and beneath it was a detailed itinerary. "This man is my competition," Sterling said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "He's checking into our sister hospital across town tomorrow for a minor, but confidential, procedure. I need you to get me his private medical records." Clara stared at him, the beautiful dream shattering around her, replaced by a cold, horrifying reality. "Sir, I can't," she stammered. It's illegal. It's unethical. I could lose my license. I could go to jail." A cruel smile touched Sterling's lips. "I'm not asking you to harm him. I'm just asking for information. Information is the most valuable currency in the world, Clara, and you have access to the vault." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You will get me that file. In return, your brother will want for nothing for the rest of his life. It's a very simple choice." He leaned forward again, his eyes like chips of ice. "But if you refuse, if you even think about telling anyone about this conversation, I will crush you. I will make a few phone calls. Your job will disappear. Your reputation will be ruined. And I will make sure that every single hospital in this city knows your name, and not in a good way. Your brother will lose his insurance, his care, everything. You will both have nothing." He sat back, the offer laid bare. A dream on one side, a nightmare on the other. He wasn't asking her to make a choice. He was telling her what the choice had to be. Clara sat frozen in the chair, the folder feeling like it was burning in her hands. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor on the wall seemed to mock her, counting down the seconds of her freedom. She was trapped in a cage made of her own love for her brother, and the man holding the key was smiling. The folder felt like a block of ice in her hands. Clara didn't remember standing up, didn't remember walking to the door. Her body was moving on its own, a puppet with its strings cut, lurching through motions it had performed 1,000 times but now felt completely alien. The soft click of the door closing behind her was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She leaned against the cool wall of the corridor, her breath catching in her throat. The world swam in front of her eyes, the familiar hallway of the ward stretching and twisting like a funhouse mirror. A doctor walked past, giving her a friendly nod, but his face was a blur, his smile a meaningless slash of white. She felt like she was wearing a sign, a glowing neon label that only he could see that read, trapped, desperate, compromised. She somehow made it to the locker room, her fingers fumbling with the combination on her lock. The number swam in her vision. Inside, she shoved the folder into her bag, her movements jerky and unnatural. It was a contaminant, a piece of radioactive material that was poisoning her simple, clean life. She changed out of her scrubs with mechanical efficiency, her mind a million miles away, replaying his words, the cold certainty in his eyes, the devastatingly beautiful dream he had dangled in front of her before snatching it away and replacing it with a nightmare. The bus ride home was a blur of passing city lights and anonymous faces. Clara stared out the grimy window, but she wasn't seeing the streets. She was seeing a reflection. A tired, pale woman with haunted eyes. But for a moment, the reflection shifted. The tiredness was replaced by a sharp, calculating alertness. The scrubs became a tailored, dark suit. The haunted eyes became cold and observant. The woman in the window wasn't Clara, the nurse. She was someone else. Someone she had buried so deep she thought she could never be resurrected. Someone named Cassandra. The name echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. A ghost from a life she had desperately tried to forget. It wasn't a life of saving people. It was a life of managing problems for the powerful and corrupt. She wasn't a nurse then. She was a crisis manager, a title that sounded so much cleaner than what she actually did. She was a fixer, a cleaner, a human tool for a family whose wealth was built on shadows, a memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of her shock. She was 22, standing in the glittering ballroom of a 5-star hotel, a glass of champagne in her hand that she never drank. She was wearing a dress that cost more than her first car. Her target that night was a young accountant who had found a discrepancy in his firm's books, a discrepancy that led directly to her employers. He was nervous, idealistic, and planning to go to the authorities in the morning. Her job was not to threaten him. It was subtler than that. She had found him at the bar, feigning interest in his work, listening to him with wide, sympathetic eyes. She made him feel smart, feel seen. She didn't offer him a bribe. She offered him a story, a carefully constructed tale about how his discovery would ruin the lives of dozens of low-level employees, people just like him, who would lose their jobs. She painted a picture of him as a villain, not a hero. She gave him an alternative, a way to correct the error quietly, to be the savior instead of the whistleblower. By the end of the night, he was thanking her for her guidance, convinced that staying silent was the most moral choice. She had dismantled his integrity with a smile and a few well-chosen words. She had gotten the information she needed, and she had neutralized the threat without a single threat being made. That was her skill. Not breaking into files, but breaking into people. Using their own hopes, fears, and principles against them. It was a gift, and she had sold it to the highest bidder. The memory brought a wave of nausea so strong she had to grip the back of the bus seat in front of her. She had spent the last 10 years trying to wash that blood from her hands, trying to balance the scales by doing good, by actually saving lives instead of ruining them. Becoming a nurse was her penance. She stumbled off the bus and into the cool night air. The walk to her small apartment felt endless. When she finally locked the door behind her, the silence of the room was deafening. She dropped her bag on the floor, the folder with its terrible contents spilling out. She sank onto her sofa, the weight of the past and the present crushing her. She looked at the picture of Leo on the mantelpiece, his bright smile a beacon in the darkness of her thoughts. She did it all for him, and now the very skills she had used to build this new, clean life for him were the reason it was all about to be destroyed. And then, like a lightning bolt cutting through a stormy sky, a terrifying thought struck her. Sterling's rival, the man whose medical files he wanted, she knew that name. She had seen it in the business news, but it wasn't just from there. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking, and searched for the name. There he was, the CEO of a massive tech conglomerate. The same conglomerate that was run by the family she used to work for. The family she had fled. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random act of cruelty against a poor, desperate nurse. He hadn't found Clara, he had hunted down Cassandra. He had dug through her past, found the one thing that connected her to his enemy, and had set a trap so perfect, so specific, it could only have been designed for her. He didn't just want a nurse who could access a file. He wanted her. He wanted the ghost, the fixer, the manipulator. The realization was a cold shock, but it was also strangely clarifying. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her belly, but it was no longer in charge. She was not a random victim. She was a target. And a target can fight back. Just then, her phone rang, shrill and insistent in the quiet room. It was the night nurse who stayed with Leo. "Clara," the nurse's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm sorry to call so late." Leo had a bit of a rough spell. His breathing was a little shallow. "We got him stable, but the doctor thinks we should keep a very close eye on him tonight." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. The abstract threat, the what if, had suddenly become a terrifying reality. The clock was no longer just ticking, it was pounding. She looked at the folder on the floor, then at Leo's picture. She was caught in a trap, with her brother's life on one side and her soul on the other. She couldn't steal the file. That would be destroying the new person she had fought so hard to become. But she couldn't do nothing. That would be letting Leo down. She stood up and walked to the small mirror hanging by the door. She looked at her reflection, at the tired nurse with the haunted eyes. But this time, she didn't just see Clara, she saw the flicker of someone else behind her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, something hard and sharp that she hadn't felt in a decade. It was the cold, clear resolve of Cassandra. She realized then that the only way out of Sterling's trap was not to run from her past, but to walk right back into it. She would go to him, but she would not go as his victim. She would go as the woman he thought he was hiring, and she would give him exactly what he wanted. The walk down the corridor to his room was the longest she had ever taken. Each step was deliberate, her worn-out sneakers no longer squeaking with hurried fatigue but making a soft, rhythmic sound on the floor. The familiar weight of exhaustion was gone, replaced by a strange, light clarity, as if a heavy fog had finally lifted from her mind. She pushed open the door to his room without knocking, a small act of defiance that would have been unthinkable just a day ago. He was in bed, propped up against his pillows, a tablet in his hand. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his gray eyes at the sudden intrusion, which quickly morphed into a smug, confident smirk. He put the tablet down, ready to receive her answer, expecting tears or anger or fearful stammering acceptance. He saw none of those things. Clara closed the door softly behind her, the click of the latch sounding final and absolute. She didn't approach the bed immediately. She stood for a moment, her posture straight, her shoulders back. She looked at him not as a nurse looks at a patient, but as an equal looks at a rival. The change in her was so palpable that the smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a look of keen, curious interest. "You wanted to hire Cassandra," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotion. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sterling leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't confirm or deny it. He simply watched her, intrigued. "I made you a business proposition, Clara." "You made a proposition to a nurse you thought you could break," she corrected him, taking a step closer to the bed. "But you didn't do your homework well enough. You found the name, you found the connection to my former employers, but you didn't understand the person. You thought you were hiring a desperate woman. But the woman you wanted, the one you call Cassandra, doesn't get desperate. She gets even. She began to pace slowly at the foot of his bed, her movements fluid and controlled, like a caged animal finally let loose. You're right, I used to work for them. The family that runs your rival's company. But I wasn't just an employee. I was their best asset. My job wasn't to steal files, Mr. Sterling. That's so crude, so messy. My job was to walk into a room, to talk to people, and to walk out with their secrets. Not because I threatened them, but because I made them want to give them to me. I could make a man feel like a king for betraying his own brother. I could make a woman feel empowered for ruining her best friend's career. I didn't use a lockpick. I used their own hopes, their own fears, their own pride. That was my weapon. She stopped pacing and looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. I was very good at it. I was young and the power was intoxicating. I told myself it was just a game, that these were powerful people who could take care of themselves. But then one day it wasn't a game anymore. A mission went too far. A life was ruined, not just a career. And I saw the monster I had become. So I left. I burned that entire life to the ground, changed my name, and disappeared. I became a nurse because I wanted to save lives, not destroy them. Every four I've inserted, every hand I've held, every life I've fought to save, that has been my apology, my penance. The room was silent. Sterling was no longer smirking. He was listening, truly listening, his expression a mask of intense concentration. He saw her now, not as a pawn in his game, but as a player he had drastically underestimated. You didn't find a poor nurse who happened to have a connection to your enemy, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. You hunted down the one person in the world who knows their weaknesses better than they know them themselves. You wanted me to use my old skills to get you a medical file. But you were thinking too small? A medical file can be explained away. A leak can be contained. It's a short-term victory. She walked to the side of his bed and leaned in slightly, her voice almost a conspiratorial murmur. I will not be your weapon, Mr. Sterling. I will not go back to being that person. But I will give you something better. Something that will end this war for you, permanently and legally. She straightened up. During my time with them, I handled their personal finances. I saw a pattern. Every quarter, a series of small, seemingly random donations were made to a handful of obscure international charities. They were always just under the reporting limit. I always thought it was for tax purposes, a bit of creative accounting. But one day, I saw a list of the board members of one of those charities. It was a shell corporation. They weren't donating money. They were laundering it, siphoning it out of the company in a way that was almost impossible to trace. I memorized the names of the charities, the sequence of the donations, and the offshore accounts they were tied to. It's all in my head. It's information I gained legally by doing my job. And it's enough to send your rival to prison for the rest of his life. No stolen medical records needed. No messy trails. Just a quiet, anonymous tip to the right financial crimes investigator, and his empire will crumble. She looked him in the eye, her expression clear and resolute. I will give you this information. Not for my brother's care. That will be a separate transaction. You will pay for his treatment as a consulting fee for the information I'm about to give you. A clean, legitimate business deal. My brother gets his life and you get your victory. And I get to keep my soul. Do we have a deal? Sterling stared at her, his mind clearly racing. He was a man who understood power, and in that moment, he was in the presence of a power he hadn't anticipated. He saw not a broken nurse, but a brilliant, formidable woman who had just turned his own cruel game against him. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile of respect, not of predation. He had come looking for a tool and had found an equal. He nodded slowly. We have a deal. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy, after he spoke the words. We have a deal. For Clara, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, then slowly settle back into place, but everything was different now. The air was clearer, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. Sterling didn't waste a second. He picked up his tablet from the bedside table, his fingers moving with a swift, practiced certainty across the screen. He was a man who was used to making things happen, to turning words into reality. He put in a call, his voice low and commanding. "Get me the legal team. I need a non-disclosure and a services agreement drafted and couriered to the hospital. Now." He listened for a moment, his eyes flicking up to meet Clara's. "The beneficiary is a Leo Evans, all medical expenses in perpetuity, and a trust fund for his ongoing care. Make it substantial." He ended the call and placed the tablet down, his business finished. The sheer speed and efficiency of it was breathtaking. He had just agreed to change a young man's life with the same casual effort he would use to order a meal. Less than 2 hours later, a man in a perfectly tailored suit arrived, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Sterling's attorney. He didn't look at Clara with pity or suspicion, but with a kind of professional neutrality, as if she were just another high-level consultant closing a major deal. He laid out the documents on the small table in the room. There were pages and pages of dense legal text, but Clara didn't need to read it all. The attorney pointed to the key clauses. The non-disclosure agreement was ironclad, binding her to silence about their entire arrangement. The services agreement was just as clear. In exchange for the financial intelligence she had provided, Sterling's corporation would establish and maintain a trust fund for all of Leo's medical and care needs for the rest of his life. It was all there in black and white. It was real. Clara signed her name with a steady hand, the signature feeling both foreign and familiar, like a promise she was making to her younger self and to her brother's future. Walking out of that room was a completely different experience from walking in. The corridor that had felt like a gauntlet now seemed just a hallway. The other nurses, the doctors, the patients, they were all part of a world she was still a part of, but she was no longer drowning in it. She went home that night, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't lie awake listening for the phone, her stomach churning with anxiety. She slept. A deep, dreamless, profound sleep that felt like it lasted for years. When she woke up, the sun was streaming through her window, and for a moment, she couldn't remember why she felt so light. Then the memory of the previous day came flooding back, not as a nightmare, but as a surreal, life-altering dream. The first real proof came 2 days later. She was at home on a rare day off when her phone rang. It was the head of Leo's care team. "Clara, I have some incredible news," the doctor said, his voice filled with an excitement she had never heard before. "We've been contacted by a private foundation. An anonymous benefactor has fully funded a new experimental treatment protocol for Leo. The best specialist in the country is flying in to consult, and they're arranging for a state-of-the-art ventilator and monitoring system to be installed in your apartment. All costs covered. I don't know what you did, Clara, but this is a miracle." Clara sank into her chair, the phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of joy, not yet. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The ocean she had been trying to bail out with a teacup had suddenly, miraculously, parted. Her return to the hospital ward a few days later was like stepping into a life she used to know. The same sounds, the same smells, the same endless cycle of needs and emergencies. But she was different. She moved with a new quiet confidence, the frantic energy replaced by a calm, steady presence. She was no longer a ghost haunting the halls. She was a part of them, solid and real. One afternoon she saw a young new nurse being berated by a senior doctor for a minor mistake. The nurse's face was flushed with humiliation, her eyes welling up. In the past, Clara would have kept her head down and hurried past, not wanting to get involved. But this time she walked over. She didn't confront the doctor angrily. She simply placed a gentle hand on the young nurse's shoulder and said to the doctor, "Dr. Evans, the lab just called with Mr. Henderson's results. They need you to sign off on them immediately." It was a small, white lie, but it was delivered with such calm authority that the doctor, flustered, simply grunted and stalked away. Clara turned to the young nurse and gave her a small, reassuring smile. We all make mistakes. He's just having a bad day. Don't let it get to you. She was using the old skills. The ability to read a room and redirect a situation, but this time she was using them to protect. Not to destroy. The day finally came for Damien Sterling to be discharged. Clara was on duty as she watched from the nurse's station as he was wheeled out of his room. He was dressed in a crisp, dark suit, looking every bit the powerful billionaire. He looked stronger, healthier. As his attendants wheeled him towards the elevator, his path took him right past the station. For a moment, their eyes met across the bustling corridor. The noise of the ward seemed to fade into a dull hum. There was no smile on his face, no smugness, no cruelty. There was only a look of cool, clear acknowledgement. He gave her a single, slow nod. It was a gesture that said more than words ever could. It was a sign of respect. It was the closing of a chapter. Clara held his gaze for a second and then nodded back. A simple, equal exchange between two people who had seen a part of each other that no one else ever had. Later that evening, as she walked home under the city lights, she thought about the two women she had been. There was Cassandra, the ghost from her past, the manipulator with the sharp mind and hollow heart. And there was Clara, the tired, frightened nurse, running from a life she could never truly escape. She realized now that she was neither of those women anymore. She was something new. She was a woman who had faced the worst parts of herself and hadn't flinched. A woman who had stared down a monster and found a way to tame it. Not with a bigger monster, but with her own hard-won integrity. She was a nurse, a caregiver, a sister. She was a woman who had made a terrible choice and then made a right one. The name Cassandra no longer had power over her. It was just a scar or a reminder of a wound that had healed, leaving her stronger. And the name Clara, which meant clear and bright, finally felt like her own. She was just a woman walking home from her job, but she was also so much more. She was whole.